The Spring Festival in Guadalajara was known for being one of the largest celebrations of the year. Entire families gathered in the Central Park to enjoy the colors, the flavors, and the music that filled the air. Children ran around with their balloons, while adults strolled between food stalls, admiring local crafts and street performances. Among the crowd, Miguel walked with his daughter, Sofia, who was in her wheelchair, pushed by her father. Despite the difficulties she faced due to her disability, Sofia maintained a radiant smile. She was the pride of her father, who had raised her with love and protection, fully aware that the world was not always kind to people like her. The afternoon passed without incident. Miguel chatted with some acquaintances at the festival while Sofia watched the fireworks that were starting to light up the sky with delight. The little girl was known for her cheerful spirit, despite the physical limitations that kept her in her chair. Her smile never faded, and every little detail excited her as if it were the first time. For Miguel, those moments shared with his daughter were sacred. However, in the midst of the afternoon's happiness, something dark was approaching, something that would change their lives forever. A few meters away, a uniformed man was watching them with a dark expression. It was Officer Carlos, a policeman known in the city for his arrogant attitude and tendency to use unnecessary violence. His gaze was fixed on Sofia and her father, as if they had committed some crime simply by existing in that space. Miguel didn't notice at first, but soon he felt the weight of that hostile stare. The air around them seemed to grow cold, and the peace of the festival shattered when Carlos began walking toward them with determined steps. Suddenly, Officer Carlos stopped in front of them, blocking their path with an intimidating posture. The people around them began to notice the tension in the air, but no one intervened. Without saying a word, Carlos stood in front of Sofia and Miguel, looking at them with disdain. Miguel tried to calm the situation, aware of the reputation of this policeman. He didn't understand why they had been so aggressively stopped, but soon realized this was no mere coincidence. There was something in Carlos's eyes that seemed familiar, a mix of hatred and misused power. The officer stepped closer to Sofia, and Miguel, uneasy, tried to get between them. It was in vain. Carlos, in an unexpected and brutal move, extended his hand and grabbed Sofia's hair, yanking with excessive force. The little girl screamed in pain, her trembling hands clutching the arms of her wheelchair as she tried to understand what was happening. Sofia's scream echoed throughout the park, and the people, who had until that moment been immersed in the joy of the festival, came to an abrupt halt. Miguel, shocked, reacted quickly, but Carlos shoved him backward with enough force to make him stumble. He fell to his knees, looking at his daughter with a mix of rage and despair. His mind raced as he tried to process the irrational violence unfolding before his eyes. This was not just a physical attack, it was a blatant act of cruelty against a defenseless child. Miguel got to his feet as fast as he could, but the damage was already done. Sofia's hair was tangled in the officer's hand, who seemed to take pleasure in the suffering he was causing. The people around them started murmuring. Some pulled out their phones to record what was happening, while others simply watched in shock, unable to comprehend how a peaceful afternoon had taken such a violent turn. The silence of the festival was replaced by cries of outrage. The horrified looks were directed at the officer, but there was also fear in the crowd's eyes. They knew who Carlos was, they knew his reputation, and they knew that intervening could have serious consequences. Sofia, with tears streaming down her cheeks, tried to calm herself, but her body trembled uncontrollably. The physical pain mixed with humiliation. Throughout her life, she had faced challenges due to her disability, but she had never felt anything like what she was experiencing at that moment. Despite her young age, she understood that what was happening was not just an assault. There was a deeper hatred, something she couldn't fully understand, but it terrified her in a way she had never experienced before. Miguel managed to stand up again and lunged toward Carlos, trying to pull him away from his daughter. This time, his strength was driven by rage and desperation. He grabbed the officer by the arm, pulling with all the energy he had, but Carlos, wearing his uniform and wielding his authority, wasn't willing to back down. The physical violence escalated. Miguel knew he was challenging a man wearing a badge, but at that moment, he didn't care. The only thing that mattered was Sofia, his little warrior, who now sobbed in her wheelchair, completely defenseless. Within seconds, more people began to surround the scene. Some shouted for help, while others continued recording with their phones. The outrage in the crowd grew with each passing second. It was as if time had stopped, and all that mattered in that instant was the girl in the wheelchair and the man who was attacking her for no reason. Carlos, aware that his violence was being recorded by the phone cameras, began to lose control. His face, once full of disdain, now showed signs of nervousness. He knew that his actions had crossed a line he could not undo. Miguel finally managed to pull Carlos away from his daughter. Sofia, trembling, brought her hands to her hair, feeling the spot where it had been brutally yanked. Her eyes, once full of life, now reflected those of a broken child. Miguel, his heart filled with fury, stood face to face with the officer, his body tense and fists clenched. He wanted to do something, anything, to stop this nightmare, but he knew there were limits he couldn't cross. However, deep inside, a promise began to form: he would seek justice, no matter the cost. The crowd, which until that moment had been mere spectators, began to move. Some people approached Miguel to offer help, while others started surrounding Carlos, confronting him for his brutality. Police sirens wailed in the distance, and the situation was about to escalate even further. The park, once a place of joy and celebration, had now become the epicenter of an act of hatred and violence that would echo far beyond that day. The sound of the sirens grew louder, approaching the epicenter of the chaos that had erupted in the Central Park. The festival, which minutes earlier had been filled with joy, was now engulfed in a mixture of confusion, anger, and fear. As the patrol cars arrived, the crowd gathered around Miguel and Sofia. The people, once bewildered, now showed clear signs of outrage. Recordings continued, and whispers about injustice and police brutality spread like wildfire. Sofia remained in her wheelchair, but she was no longer the same smiling girl as before. Her head was down, her hair partially torn, and her small body still trembled visibly. The little girl's eyes were filled with tears, but she did not cry out loud, as if her spirit had been silenced by the attack. Miguel leaned down to his daughter, trying to comfort her while the chaos continued around them. His heart broke seeing her so vulnerable and humiliated, his little warrior now shattered by the cruelty of a man who was supposed to protect her. Miguel's hands gently stroked Sofia's head, trying to console her, but he didn't know how. The damage Carlos had caused wasn't just physical, he had torn away his daughter's innocence in a way Miguel could never have anticipated. As the crowd grew louder and more people arrived to witness what was happening, the governor knew he had to stay strong. It was no longer just about defending his daughter, it was about confronting a deeper injustice that affected everyone who had witnessed this horror. Suddenly, a group of police officers arrived on the scene, pushing their way through the crowd. The tension in the air was palpable. Miguel braced himself for the worst, fearing that the backup officers might support Carlos and make the situation even worse. However, something unexpected happened. The looks on some of the officers' faces showed confusion and concern as they approached Officer Carlos, who was still trying to justify his actions. The backup officers began questioning what had occurred, and the crowd wasted no time giving their version of events, accusing the officer of abuse of power. The recordings on mobile phones were shown to the arriving officers, who watched in disbelief at the brutality with which Carlos had attacked Sofia. Carlos, realizing that his situation was worsening, began to lose his composure. His arguments were vague, and his authoritarian tone failed to conceal the fear creeping into him. The crowd demanded justice, calling for the officer to be arrested right then and there for his abuse. The voices of those present grew louder, fueled by a mix of indignation and rage that echoed in every corner of the park. The families who had been enjoying the festival now joined the cause, and each new witness seemed to add another piece to the story of what had happened. The call for justice soon drowned out the sound of the sirens, creating an atmosphere even more charged with tension. One of the backup officers approached Miguel, asking him to explain what had happened. Miguel, his face still tense with fury, recounted the attack in precise detail, leaving out nothing of the pain he had witnessed in his daughter. His voice was firm, but the latent pain in his words was unmistakable. Every sentence he spoke was weighed down with emotional weight that resonated not only in the ears of the officers but also in the hearts of everyone listening. As Miguel spoke, Sofia watched him in silence, gripping her wheelchair tightly. Her small hand trembled as she tried to process everything that had happened. The park, which had once been a refuge of fun and entertainment, now seemed like a threatening place, filled with shadows and danger. The officer who had listened to Miguel nodded silently, looking at Carlos with a critical gaze. He knew the situation was delicate. The evidence was clear, and the mobile phone recordings left no room for doubt. Meanwhile, Carlos, aware that he was losing control of the situation, tried to defend himself with confusing arguments, but his voice grew weaker by the moment. The evidence was against him, and the pressure from the crowd only heightened his nervousness. The tension reached its peak when, finally, one of the backup officers approached Carlos, ordered him to step aside, and handcuffed him in front of the crowd. The act of placing handcuffs on Carlos sparked an immediate reaction from the crowd. There was an eruption of applause and shouts of support, while others continued recording the moment on their phones. Miguel's eyes filled with tears as he watched the man who had hurt his daughter finally face the consequences of his actions. But the relief was not complete. He knew that Carlos's arrest would not erase the trauma Sofia had experienced, nor would it restore the peace that had been torn from their hearts on that fateful day. Miguel looked at his daughter, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. All the chaos around him faded away, and it was just him and Sofia, sharing that deep pain that bonded them even more. He knelt beside her, gently taking her hand as the little girl tried to compose herself. He knew he had to be strong, for her and for everyone who had suffered similar injustices. In his mind, he was already planning the next steps. He would not let this incident be forgotten, nor would he allow Carlos to escape justice. The park, which had been the scene of a tragedy minutes earlier, was now filled with hope. People who had previously stayed silent began speaking to one another, sharing their own stories of abuse and injustice. Miguel understood that this incident had sparked something in the community, a spark that would not be easily extinguished. The coming days would be crucial, and he was determined to fight for his daughter and for all those who had been silenced. As the officers took Carlos away and the crowd slowly began to disperse, Miguel felt that this was only the beginning of a long battle. He knew the road to justice would be difficult, but he was not alone. The community stood behind him, and more importantly, his daughter needed him now more than ever. Miguel sat next to Sofia in the emergency room at the hospital, watching as a nurse gently cleaned the wounds on her scalp. The incident at the park had been a nightmare he couldn't shake off. Seeing his daughter broken by the unjustified violence of an officer had left a deep mark on him. Every tear that fell from Sofia's face made him feel a mix of helplessness and rage. He had witnessed something he never thought would happen to his family. As the state governor, Miguel had always strived to improve conditions for his community, fight against abuse, and protect the most vulnerable. However, he now found himself at the center of a personal tragedy that symbolized everything he had tried to change in his political career. Sofia remained silent. She hadn't uttered a word since they brought her to the hospital, and that worried Miguel deeply. His little warrior, who had always faced challenges with a smile, now seemed distant, as if a part of her had shut down. Miguel clenched his fists, remembering Officer Carlos's face, the man who had shattered his daughter's innocence. The rage inside him grew, but he knew he had to control himself for Sofia's sake. He couldn't let hatred consume him, he had to stay focused on what came next. Justice was his only path. As the nurse finished treating Sofia, a doctor entered the room. She explained to Miguel that, although the physical damage wasn't severe, the emotional and psychological effects could be devastating. Sofia had experienced a deep trauma, and she would need emotional support to overcome the fear and humiliation she had endured. Miguel nodded silently, understanding that what his daughter needed now was something far more complex than a simple medical treatment. He knew the healing process would be long, but he was determined to be by her side every step of the way. When the doctor left, Miguel knelt in front of Sofia. He looked her straight in the eyes, searching for any trace of the strong, joyful girl he knew, but her eyes were empty. With a broken voice, he promised her that he would not let this act of hatred go unanswered. His voice was low but filled with determination. He told her that he would do everything in his power to make sure Carlos and those who allowed this abuse would face justice. He knew words alone couldn't heal his daughter's pain, but he also knew that as a father and as governor, he had a responsibility to fight. As they left the hospital, the lights from the media cameras blinded him for a moment. Journalists had already gathered outside, waiting for a statement about what had happened. Social media was flooded with videos of the attack, and the incident had sparked a wave of outrage across the country. Miguel knew this was a crucial moment. He could feel the tension in the air as journalists fired questions, eager for him to speak about what had happened in the park. He knew he had to handle the situation carefully, but he also felt the urgency to expose the brutality his daughter had faced. Miguel stopped in front of the cameras, raising a hand to silence the crowd of reporters. He spoke in a firm but restrained voice. He described the attack without going into too much detail, explaining that Sofia had been the victim of brutal abuse by a police officer during a public festival. He couldn't hide the pain in his words, but he remained composed. He said he trusted the authorities to take the necessary steps to investigate the case, but he made it clear that he would not stand by idly. He demanded a full investigation, promising that they would not rest until justice was served. The community listened intently, and Miguel knew that every word he spoke resonated beyond that small crowd. It wasn't just his daughter who had been attacked. This act of violence symbolized a much broader issue, the abuse of power that affected so many Black, disabled, and vulnerable people across the country. Miguel realized that this incident had touched a deep nerve in society, and that his fight for Sofia would become a fight for many others. After his statement, Miguel got into the car, with Sofia sitting silently beside him. The drive home was long and filled with dark thoughts. He knew that his life would never be the same. The pain his daughter had suffered would follow him for a long time, but he also knew that this was the beginning of a battle for something bigger. When they finally arrived home, Miguel sat down in the living room, exhausted. His wife, Mariana, was waiting for them, her eyes filled with worry. Mariana hugged Sofia tenderly as Miguel explained what had happened. Mariana, always a strong and supportive woman, remained silent as she listened to the story. She knew there were no words that could ease the pain of that moment. However, she told Miguel that she was ready to support him in everything. She knew that what was coming wouldn't be easy and that the fight for justice wouldn't just take place in the courts. They would have to confront a system filled with prejudice, and that would put them at the center of a political and social storm. That night, as Miguel and Mariana sat at the dining table, they went over their legal options. They knew they had to act quickly, not only to ensure that Carlos was punished but also to protect other families from suffering the same fate. The images of the attack had already reached national news, and the community's reactions were mixed. Some were calling for justice, while others were defending the officer, arguing that he had acted in self-defense. Miguel couldn't believe there were people willing to justify what had happened, but he knew that racism and discrimination were deeply ingrained in many parts of society. That night, they barely slept. The anger and sadness consumed them, but so did a firm determination. Miguel watched Sofia as she slept, wondering how he could protect her future in such a cruel world. He knew he couldn't make the pain disappear, but he was determined to do everything possible to ensure his daughter grew up in a fairer place. His promise of justice wasn't just for Sofia, it was for every person who had been mistreated, for every child who had suffered the violence of racism or police brutality. Miguel knew that what had started as a family day at the park had triggered a battle that would define the rest of his life. The attack on Sofia was a symbol of the fight against hate and injustice. And he, as a father and as a leader, would not stop until he saw the change he had fought for. The next morning, Miguel woke up with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The previous day had been the most painful of his life, but now he had to focus on what was to come. Mariana prepared breakfast in silence while Sofia still slept, exhausted from the long night of nightmares. Miguel glanced at his phone, which wouldn't stop buzzing with messages and calls. Since the incident at the park, the story had taken a massive turn on social media and in the news. The images of the attack had gone viral, sparking a wave of outrage and calls to action across the country. Miguel's family home, which had always been a quiet refuge, was now surrounded by cameras and journalists. The situation had ceased to be a private matter. Sofia's face, the little girl in the wheelchair, had become the symbol of something much bigger. People were beginning to organize, and Miguel could feel that the community was ready to act. But that also meant tensions would rise. He knew there would be those who would try to discredit their fight, who would defend Officer Carlos and justify his brutality. Miguel got up from the table and went to the study, where he sat in front of his desk full of papers. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He called one of his closest friends, a civil rights lawyer who had worked with him in the past. He needed legal advice and support to face what was coming. The lawyer, Samuel, assured him that his team was already working on the case. The videos and witness testimonies would be key to building a solid case against Carlos and the police department that had allowed such behavior for so long. It was the first step in what promised to be a long legal battle. While Miguel was speaking with Samuel, his phone rang again. This time, it was a community leader informing him that a march was being organized in support of Sofia and in protest of police brutality. The march was scheduled for that very afternoon, and hundreds of people had already confirmed their attendance. Miguel was silent for a moment. He knew the community needed to make their voices heard, but he also feared for everyone's safety. Marches often attracted the attention of the authorities, and he didn't want the situation to get out of control. However, he understood that this was a key moment. People needed to express their frustration and support, and Miguel had to be at the forefront of that movement. After hanging up, Miguel stepped out into the backyard, looking for a moment of calm. Mariana found him there, her face full of concern. She knew that the weight of what was happening was falling on her husband's shoulders, but she also knew that he was the leader the community needed at that moment. Mariana reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight, that many people were supporting them, and that Sofia needed them more than ever. Miguel hugged her silently, grateful for her strength. He knew he had a huge responsibility, not just as a father, but as a representative of all those who had been silenced for so long. Hours later, the city was in turmoil. The streets were filling with people marching with signs and banners demanding justice for Sofia and an end to police brutality. Miguel arrived at the gathering point accompanied by Mariana and some close friends. They had decided to keep Sofia at home, protected from the chaos, while they faced the storm of emotions and demands that flooded the streets. As they moved through the crowd, Miguel could feel the energy around him. The cries for justice, the protest songs, the sound of feet marching in unison, all combined into a call for change. The people around him greeted him, offering words of encouragement and showing their unconditional support. Miguel felt a mix of pride and responsibility. Every face he saw, every hand he shook, reminded him why this fight was so important. As they walked, his mind kept returning to the image of Sofia in the hospital, his little warrior, broken but still standing. He knew this march wasn't just for her, but for all the children who had suffered at the hands of an unjust and oppressive system. When they reached the central point of the march, Miguel climbed onto an improvised stage. The crowd greeted him with applause and cheers of support. The noise was deafening, but he knew he had to speak. The community needed to hear his words. He took a moment to observe everyone present, the families, the young, the elderly, all united for a common cause. When he finally began to speak, his voice was firm but filled with emotion. He spoke of the pain he had felt watching his daughter suffer, but he also spoke of the need to turn that pain into action. He told them that this fight wasn't just for Sofia, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by violence and racism. He reminded them that change would only come if they remained united, if they kept fighting, even when things seemed impossible. The crowd listened in complete silence, each word resonating in their hearts. Miguel knew that many of those standing there had experienced the same kind of injustice. He wasn't alone in his pain, and that realization gave him strength. As he spoke, he saw faces full of hope, people who believed in the possibility of a better future. He realized that despite the tragedy he had lived through, something positive was emerging from all the chaos. The community was rising, and he was proud to be part of that change. When he finished his speech, the applause was deafening. Miguel felt a wave of relief seeing the unity that had formed. He knew there was still a long way to go, but he also knew he had taken the first step. The march continued peacefully, and the voices of the community echoed with strength in every corner of the city. Sofia's case had ceased to be a personal tragedy and had become a movement for justice that would not stop until change was achieved. As the march moved forward, Miguel walked among the crowd, receiving words of encouragement and support from people he had never met before. Each gesture of solidarity strengthened him. Mariana watched from a distance, proud of how her husband had taken on leadership in the midst of adversity. She knew that this fight was just beginning, but she also knew that together, they could face whatever was coming. At the end of the day, when the march came to a close, Miguel realized that the real work was only beginning. The next few weeks would be critical. Legal actions would need to be prepared, public scrutiny would have to be faced, and attempts to cover up the truth would need to be fought against. But for the first time since the incident, he felt he wasn't alone in his battle. The community had risen, and now the world was listening. The first weeks after the march were a whirlwind of activity. The community remained active, organizing meetings and vigils, while Miguel's legal team prepared for the battle in court. Samuel, his lawyer, had fully immersed himself in the case, analyzing every video, every testimony, and every detail that could be used to secure a conviction against Carlos and, potentially, push for police department reform. However, Miguel knew it wouldn't be an easy fight. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the judicial system was complex and often unfair, especially when dealing with cases of police brutality. Sofia, for her part, had physically recovered from her injuries, but the emotional trauma remained. Miguel and Mariana had enrolled her in therapy, and although Sofia participated in the sessions, she had yet to return to the cheerful child she was before the attack. She spent most of her time in her room, avoiding going to the park or attending public events. Mariana tried to encourage her, but she knew that Sofia needed time to process what had happened. Meanwhile, Miguel was constantly caught between his public responsibilities and caring for his daughter. The stress of the situation was beginning to weigh on him, but he knew he couldn't give up. One morning, while reviewing case documents in his office, he received a call from Samuel. The lawyer informed him that Carlos's defense team had requested a postponement for the trial, claiming they needed more time to review the evidence. This infuriated Miguel. He knew this was a common tactic to wear down victims, hoping that the pressure and frustration would cause them to give up. But he had no intention of backing down. He asked Samuel to keep up the pressure and not let the case be unnecessarily delayed. Justice for Sofia couldn't wait. As the weeks passed, tensions in the city grew. There were sectors that openly supported Carlos, claiming that the police were simply doing their job and that the incident had been exaggerated by the media. Some media outlets even began publishing articles suggesting that Sofia and Miguel were using the case for media attention and political gain. These accusations were hurtful, but Miguel tried not to pay attention. He knew his fight was just, and the truth was on his side. Despite the challenges, messages of support continued to pour in from all over. Human rights organizations, activists against police brutality, and public figures spoke out in support of Sofia. Social media was flooded with messages of encouragement, and the story continued to be a recurring topic in national news. For many, Sofia's case represented something much bigger, the fight against a system that had long allowed abuses to go unpunished. One day, while Miguel was preparing for a television interview, Samuel informed him that they had received an offer from the prosecution. Carlos had offered to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. It was a difficult decision. Accepting the deal meant Carlos would be convicted, but with a much lighter sentence than Miguel and his legal team considered fair. Samuel explained that, in practical terms, it might be the best option, as the judicial system wasn't always predictable, and risking a full trial could result in an acquittal. Miguel spent hours reflecting on the offer. He wanted full justice for Sofia, but he also knew that prolonging the case could cause more emotional harm to his daughter. He sat down with Mariana to discuss the situation. Both knew that whatever decision they made would have a profound impact on their lives and Sofia's. Mariana, always pragmatic, reminded him that the most important thing was their daughter's well-being. If accepting the deal meant putting an end to this nightmare and allowing Sofia to begin healing, perhaps it was the best option. However, Miguel was still unconvinced. He felt torn between his desire to see Carlos pay for what he had done and the need to protect his daughter from a long and painful process. The final decision came after a deep conversation with Sofia. Although the little girl hadn't spoken much since the incident, that night, as he tucked her in, she asked if the man who had hurt her would go to jail. Miguel, surprised by the question, explained the situation in simple terms. Sofia remained silent for a moment before telling him that she didn't want this to go on forever. She wanted it all to end, and she wanted to be happy again. Those words broke Miguel's heart but also gave him clarity. What Sofia needed wasn't an exemplary sentence but peace. The next day, Miguel called Samuel and informed him that they would accept the deal. It was a difficult decision, but he knew it was the right one for his family. The news of the agreement spread quickly, and reactions were mixed. Some supported the decision, understanding that Sofia's well-being was the priority, while others criticized it as a concession to a system that remained unjust. Miguel couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and frustration. He knew Carlos would receive a much lighter sentence than he deserved, but he also knew he had made the right decision for his daughter. On the day Carlos appeared in court to plead guilty, the courtroom was filled with people who had followed the case from the beginning. Miguel, sitting next to Mariana and Sofia, listened as the officer confessed to using unnecessary force and admitted his guilt. There were no emotional speeches, no sincere apologies. Carlos simply followed the legal process, showing no remorse. But for Miguel, the most important thing was that his daughter no longer had to relive the trauma over and over again. They could begin to heal, though the road to recovery would be long. As they left the courthouse, journalists were waiting outside, ready to capture the moment. Miguel paused for a second, looking around. This legal battle was over, but he knew the fight for justice and against police brutality was far from finished. There was still much work to be done. But for now, his priority was his family. Sofia needed him, and he would be by her side every step of the way. Even though the legal case had ended, the emotional scars remained open. Miguel and his family returned home, trying to resume normal life, but things after the trial were far from the same. The stress and pressure they had endured during the process lingered in the atmosphere of the house. Miguel had thought that accepting the plea deal would put an end to Sofia's suffering, but he soon realized that the path to peace was much more complicated than he had imagined. Although Sofia no longer talked much about the incident, she had become more withdrawn. The girl who used to laugh and enjoy spending time with her parents now spent long hours alone in her room. Mariana tried to engage her in activities she used to love, but Sofia seemed to have lost interest. Every time Miguel saw her like this, he felt a knot in his stomach. He knew he had made the right decision by accepting the deal, but he couldn't help but wonder if it had been enough. In his public life, Miguel continued to serve as the state governor, but Sofia's case had left an indelible mark on his political reputation. Although many supported him, there were those who saw him as a weak figure, someone who hadn't been able to achieve complete justice. The media continued to discuss the case, and public opinion was divided. Some accused Miguel of using his daughter's tragedy to gain political support, while others defended him, arguing that he had done what was necessary to protect his family. As the days passed, Miguel began to feel the weight of isolation. While he publicly maintained his work routine, he felt increasingly distant from those around him. He realized he had been so focused on fighting for justice that he had neglected his own emotional health. The nights were especially difficult. Many times, he would lie awake, mentally going over every detail of the case, every decision he had made, wondering if he could have done something differently. The guilt slowly consumed him, but he tried not to show his feelings in front of Mariana and Sofia. One afternoon, while he was in his office reviewing some documents, he received an unexpected call. It was Samuel, his lawyer, with worrying news. Apparently, some members of the local police were being investigated for covering up previous cases of abuse and brutality, and it was suspected that Carlos had been involved in other similar incidents before attacking Sofia. Although the investigation was still in its early stages, Samuel warned him that there could be more legal repercussions. This news shook Miguel deeply. He had thought the case was over, but this new revelation made him feel as though he was slipping back into the darkness. When Miguel told Mariana what Samuel had said, they both felt a mixture of fear and outrage. If Carlos had been protected by the system for so long, it meant the problem was much deeper than they had imagined. Miguel realized that his fight hadn't ended with the plea deal. There was something much bigger at stake, and although he was already emotionally exhausted, he knew he couldn't ignore what was happening. That night, as he sat on the bed next to Mariana, he confessed that he was considering doing more. He couldn't allow other officers to continue abusing their power without consequences. He told her that he wanted to launch a public campaign to demand police reform, one that would ensure cases like Sofia's would never happen again. Mariana, though worried about the impact this could have on their family, knew that Miguel couldn't simply stand by. She supported him, but also reminded him that he needed to take care of himself and Sofia in the process. The next day, Miguel made a public appearance at a press conference. In front of the media, he announced his intention to lead a campaign to reform the state's police system. He explained that his daughter's case had been the catalyst for a broader revelation about the systemic abuses that affected many people, especially marginalized communities. He spoke with determination, but also with sincerity, admitting that there were times when the weight of the fight was overwhelming. However, he said he couldn't remain silent in the face of such injustices. Reactions to his speech were immediate. The media covered it widely, and many saw him as a brave leader willing to take on the corrupt system. However, there were also critics. Some argued that he was exploiting his daughter's pain for political gain, while others believed it was a lost cause, given the immense power of the police forces and the slim chances of any reform succeeding. At home, Sofia began to notice the changes. Although she didn't talk much about it, it was clear that she understood what was happening. One day, while Miguel was working in his office, she quietly walked in and sat down in front of him. For several minutes, they said nothing, but then, in a low voice, Sofia asked if everything he was doing was for her. Miguel looked at her, surprised by the question. He explained that yes, it had all started because of what had happened to her, because what she had endured should never happen again. But he also told her that now it was about something bigger, about protecting others like her, so that no one else would have to suffer as she had. Sofia, with a maturity beyond her years, simply nodded. She told her father that she didn't want him to keep fighting if it meant he would get hurt too. Miguel, moved by her words, assured her that he was fine, and that although the fight was hard, he would see it through to the end, because it was the right thing to do. Sofia said nothing more, but before she left, she hugged him for the first time since the incident in the park. That small gesture was enough to give Miguel the strength he needed to keep going. The following days were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and political strategy. The reform campaign began to gain momentum, and more people joined the cause. Civil rights organizations, activists, and ordinary citizens began to mobilize, demanding real changes in the police system. The pressure on officials was mounting, and for the first time in a long while, Miguel felt that he was moving in the right direction. However, the road was not without obstacles. Threats began to arrive, both from public figures and anonymous individuals who saw his fight as a betrayal of law enforcement. Miguel knew he was treading dangerous ground, but there was no turning back. He had begun a battle that transcended his own life, and he was willing to face whatever was necessary to ensure that his family's sacrifice had not been in vain. At the end of that day, Miguel sat next to Mariana on their balcony, watching the sunset. He knew there was still much to do, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With Sofia and Mariana by his side, and a community that was finally rising up for justice, he was ready for whatever came next. This fight wasn't just for his daughter, but for the future of all those who had ever been silenced. The campaign for police reform had gained momentum, but with it, Miguel found himself increasingly caught in a political storm. Every day, new challenges arose from both inside and outside his circle. The media relentlessly analyzed his decisions, questioning every step he took. Meanwhile, his team tried to remain united, but the pressure was beginning to take a toll, even on his closest allies. They knew they were confronting a power structure that wouldn't easily give in. Miguel had spent years in politics, navigating the complex waters of power and influence. But now, everything felt different. This battle was personal, and the emotional cost was beginning to take its toll. He felt like he was being attacked from all sides. While fighting for reform, he also had to deal with critics who accused him of using his position for personal gain. Some opposition figures attacked him fiercely, suggesting that his insistence on change was nothing more than a political strategy to improve his public image after Sofia's attack. Despite it all, Miguel stayed focused. He knew that the fight for reform was the right thing to do, even if not everyone understood his true intentions. In meetings with his advisory team, they analyzed the progress and obstacles they were facing. Samuel, his trusted lawyer and friend, was closely following the investigations into police cover-ups. The documents revealed a web of abuse and corruption that extended far beyond Carlos. There were other officers involved, and Miguel understood he was venturing into increasingly dangerous territory. Meanwhile, at home, the situation was no easier. Although Sofia had shown signs of improvement, there were still moments when the trauma of the attack would suddenly overwhelm her. Mariana did her best to keep the household balanced, but she, too, was beginning to feel the weight of everything they were facing. Arguments between her and Miguel had become more frequent. Mariana was worried about the safety of their family, fearing that the growing media and political exposure could have serious consequences for them. She knew Miguel was determined to continue, but she questioned whether the price they were paying was too high. One night, after a long day of work, Miguel found himself alone in his home office, reviewing the latest reports on the investigations. Mariana had gone to bed early, exhausted from the stress of recent days. Miguel, however, couldn't sleep. As he read the documents, his phone rang. It was an unknown number, but he decided to answer. The voice on the other end was firm but ominous. It was a clear and direct threat. They warned him that if he didn't stop pushing for reform, the consequences would be severe, not just for him, but for his family. Miguel felt a chill run down his spine. He knew these kinds of threats were possible, but he hadn't expected them to come so soon or in such a personal way. However, as he hung up the phone, he didn't feel fear. Instead, a stronger determination began to grow inside him. He realized that the people trying to stop him were scared. They knew his fight was gaining ground, and they would do whatever it took to maintain the status quo. But Miguel wasn't willing to back down. Not now. He knew his cause was just, and he wouldn't let fear control him. The next morning, Miguel decided not to tell Mariana about the call. He knew she was already worried, and he didn't want to add more tension to their relationship. Instead, he doubled down on his efforts in the campaign. He met with community leaders, activists, and other officials who supported the reform. They were planning a series of conferences and events to increase pressure on legislators and ensure the issue remained at the center of public conversation. But as the campaign grew, so did the opposition. Several police leaders began appearing on television shows, defending their officers and arguing that Miguel's proposed reforms were excessive and unnecessary. They claimed that police officers needed more support, not more restrictions. They tried to paint Miguel as an enemy of law enforcement, someone who didn't understand the sacrifices police officers made every day. Despite their attempts to discredit him, Miguel pressed on, using every public appearance to emphasize the urgent need for change. Each time he spoke, he mentioned Sofia, reminding the audience that this fight wasn't just for her, but for all victims of police abuse. One day, during an important press conference, something unexpected happened. One of the officers who had worked under Carlos for years, a man named Raul, decided to break his silence. In front of cameras and journalists, he confessed that he had witnessed numerous cases of abuse and, like many others, had remained silent out of fear of retaliation. Raul spoke with a trembling voice, but his words were powerful. He admitted that Carlos had been involved in several previous incidents of brutality but had always been protected by his superiors. Raul's confession unleashed a media firestorm. Suddenly, Sofia's case was no longer just an individual matter, but a reflection of a systemic problem affecting the entire police department. Miguel watched with a mix of surprise and relief as the officers' statements changed the course of the public conversation. The voices that had defended Carlos and other officers were now being called into question. It was impossible to deny the corruption and abuse within the police force. But with Raul's revelation came more threats. This time, not only was Miguel in danger, but people close to Raul began to be harassed, and there were fears that officers loyal to Carlos might attempt retaliation. Miguel knew the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, but he also understood they were closer than ever to achieving real change. He had come too far to turn back. That night, when he returned home, Mariana was waiting for him. She asked if everything they were going through had been worth it. Miguel, exhausted but resolute, told her there was no other option. That although the fight was difficult, what was at stake was too important. Mariana hugged him, understanding that her husband was committed to something much larger than themselves. They were not alone in this battle. The community stood with them, and although the threats surrounded them, Miguel felt that the tide was beginning to turn. While Sofia slept in her room, unaware of the chaos unfolding around her, Miguel and Mariana promised each other that they wouldn't let fear stop them. They knew there was still much to face, but for the first time in weeks, they felt they were moving towards something positive. The truth was finally coming to light, and although the road was full of obstacles, they wouldn't let injustice win. The days following Raul's confession were a mix of chaos and hope. The investigation into police abuses had gained new momentum, and evidence of corruption within the department was mounting. Every day, new testimonies emerged, exposing a network of complicity that protected abusive officers like Carlos. Although exhausted, Miguel felt that he was finally achieving what he had set out to do. The system was beginning to crumble, and the possibility of real reform was becoming more tangible. However, with progress came new threats. Carlos's supporters and other corrupt officers began mobilizing against him. The attacks in the media intensified, and social networks were flooded with messages trying to discredit both Miguel and his supporters. Even his own safety was put at risk as he began receiving more threatening calls. He knew he was treading dangerous ground, but there was no turning back. He had come too far, and justice for Sofia, as well as for many other victims, depended on his perseverance. Despite everything, Miguel wasn't alone in his fight. The community, inspired by his courage, continued to mobilize. Vigils and demonstrations spread throughout the city. Entire families took to the streets demanding real change. Activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens united to support the reform campaign, and their movement gained an unexpected strength. The public pressure became unbearable for the authorities, and soon legislators began to cave. One morning, while preparing to attend an important meeting at the Capitol, Miguel received a call from Samuel. His lawyer's voice was filled with restrained excitement. He informed Miguel that after months of pressure, the state government had agreed to review police policies. Not only that, but a special session had been called in the legislature to discuss a comprehensive reform proposal that could transform the state's police system. It was a monumental victory, though Miguel knew he couldn't celebrate just yet. The real battle would be fought in the legislative chamber, where the interests of the police forces and their allies remained strong. The day of the vote was tense. Miguel, along with other community leaders, attended the debate in the legislature. For hours, he listened as arguments were presented both for and against the reform. There were those who passionately supported change, arguing that it was time to end police brutality and impunity. But there were also those who vehemently opposed it, claiming that the reform would undermine police authority and jeopardize public safety. Miguel sat in silence, his fists clenched as the discussions heated up. Finally, after hours of debate, the time for the vote arrived. Miguel's heart raced as he watched the legislators cast their votes. Mariana, sitting beside him, held his hand, offering her unconditional support. Each vote recorded felt like a step toward the future, toward the change they had fought so hard for. In the end, when the votes were tallied, the reform passed by a narrow margin. The relief Miguel felt was immense. It was as if a gigantic weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The applause and cheers from those present filled the room, but for Miguel, the most important thing was the sense of justice finally being achieved. He knew there was still much work to be done, but that moment, that small victory, meant that his fight had not been in vain. On their way home that night, Miguel felt lighter than he had in a long time. As they walked through the door, Mariana hugged him, her eyes filled with pride. Sofia, who had been following the process through the news, approached her father timidly. Though she wasn't one for grand gestures, this time she hugged him tightly and, for the first time since the incident, told him she was proud of him. For Miguel, that small gesture was more important than any political victory. As the days passed, the implementation of the reform began to take shape. New regulations were established for the police, including strict measures against abuse of power and corruption. Officers like Carlos, who had been protected for years, finally faced the consequences of their actions. The community felt the change, and although they knew it wouldn't be an easy or quick process, there was a renewed sense of hope in the air. Miguel, for his part, decided it was time to take a break. The battle for reform had taken a toll on him, both personally and professionally. He knew he still had much to offer, but he also understood that he needed time to heal, to be with his family, and to rebuild what had been fractured by the incident. Sofia was slowly improving, and Mariana, although exhausted, remained his rock throughout the storm. One afternoon, months after the reform was approved, the family decided to return to the park where it had all begun. It was a sunny day, much like the day of the fateful festival, but this time there was no fear or tension in the air. Miguel pushed Sophia's wheelchair while Mariana walked beside them. As they moved through the park, people recognized them and greeted them with respect. Many approached to thank Miguel for what he had done, for the fight he had led. But for Miguel, the most important thing at that moment wasn't the thanks or the praise. It was the fact that, for the first time in a long time, his family was together, enjoying a peaceful day. As he watched Sophia smile shyly as she watched other children play, he felt a calm he hadn't experienced in a long time. He had fought a hard and painful battle, but in the end, he had achieved what he set out to do, justice for his daughter and a better future for everyone. The journey had been long and full of challenges, but at that moment, as the sun set on the horizon, Miguel knew that everything had been worth it. He had faced adversity and triumphed, not only for himself but for all those who had been silenced. And as he walked back home, with Sophia and Mariana by his side, he knew that although there was still much work to do, the first step toward change had already been taken. If you enjoyed this emotional story and the fight for justice we just shared, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more moving stories like this. Give it a like, share it with your friends and family, and leave a comment below telling us what you thought of this story. Your opinion means a lot to us. And don't forget to check out the video that's appearing on the final screen, which also features an inspiring story full of overcoming challenges. Until next time.